This is Donald Philip Veach from Jacksonville, North Carolina, Camp Lejeune. Let's open with prayer. Lord, our Heavenly Father, Almighty and everlasting God, you brought us to the beginning of this day. Defend us in it with your mighty power. Grant that this day we fall into no sin, neither run into any kind of danger, that all our doings, being ordered by thy governance, may be righteous in thy sight. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, we're continuing our reading and commentary on Thomas Cranmer, the 69th Archbishop of Canterbury, the first Protestant and Reformed Archbishop after the Reformation began, leader in it. And we're using Jasper Ridley's Thomas Cranmer. I forget when it was published just offhand. I want to say in the 1960s. It's by Oxford University Press. Yeah, 1962. And then another edition in 1967. So at this point call him Ridley, I'm not sure if he's a descendant of Nicholas Ridley or not. I haven't determined that yet. We're talking about Ridley's review of the Cranmerian biographies, which he has been pointing at the polarities between the papists and the hagiographers and navigating through those varied views. So we'll pick up here with his continuing discussion of the biographies. Cranmer's old secretary, Ralph Maurice, who had a long connection with Cranmer, had returned from exile when Mary died. So Maurice knew Cranmer, went into the exile, and came back quite a significant player and eyewitness of his master leader, Thomas Cranmer. Ralph Maurice gets a lot of ink here and there from Cranmer with Cranmer readers. Like to know more about him. Maurice remembered Cranmer as the most considerate master, and that emerges, we might add, as a Cranmerian quality of kindness. He viewed kindness as an act of evangelism, of all things, and forgiving your enemy as an evangelistic event. And that was per Dr. Ashley Null. Even the Shakespearean work on Henry VIII has Gardner, a.k.a. Wiley Winchester, in that discussion. If you wanted to make a friend of Thomas Cranmer, you did him some wrong. The idea being that Cranmer would forgive someone. He could be tough at times. He has an energetic way of writing, but his nature was considerate, and Ralph Maurice points to that. As Maurice revered him as a Protestant martyr. After the publication of John Fox's first English edition, Maurice told Matthew Parker, the 71st Archbishop of Canterbury, Elizabeth I's Archbishop, and the second Protestant and Reformed Archbishop of Canterbury. Maurice told Matthew Parker that he knew many facts about Cranmer which had not appeared in John Fox's book. And at Matthew Parker's request, he wrote his reminiscences of his old master. It is certain that Fox not only read Maurice's manuscripts, but also met him. True in typical fashion, Fox was an interested recorder of history and searcher of documents, notwithstanding what the Lambeth historian librarian Maitland said about him. And he learned new facts from Maurice which had not been written down for Parker. Fox included all this information in his second edition of the Book of Martyrs in 1570. 2 years later, Parker himself published his De Antiquitate Britannica, biographies of his 70 predecessors in the See of Canterbury. And for some reason, I've not been able to get a hold of that. Need to follow up on that. I'd like to see how Matthew Parker handled all that. His 70 predecessors, indicating that Parker was the 71st and Cranmer was the 69th, with that Reginald Pole as the 70th, and Mary I's henchman. Smart guy, but trained in Italy. His chapter on Cranmer is of great interest, for although, like Fox's work, it contains some errors, Parker had been personally acquainted with Cranmer, as well as being in contact with Maurice and Fox. Meanwhile, Cranmer's enemies had not been idle. When Cope and his friends in their turn went into exile, they continued their polemics against Cranmer with undiminished bitterness. Cranmer is attacked in Harpsfield's 6 Dialogues, which Cope published under his own name at Antwerp in 1566, when Harpsfield was a prisoner in the Tower. 1576, Sanders singled out Cranmer for criticism in his book on the Anglican Schism. Got that somewhere up over there, which had not been published yet when Sanders left Madrid to join the Spanish expedition to Ireland, where he died as a fugitive in the bogs. In 1584, the future Cardinal Allen denounced Cranmer in his book, The Defense of English Catholics. Next year, Brigaris, published at Naples, my favorite city in Italy, got some stories there, publishes Flowers of Calvinism, as shown in the lives of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, John Calvin, Thomas Cranmer, John Knox, and other protectors and apostles of the Zwinglian sect. It was dedicated to Alexander Farnese of Parma, commander of the Spanish forces fighting the English in the Netherlands. 20 years later, Robert Parsons, the English Jesuit leader in Rome, joined the attack on Cranmer in his book, The Three Conversions of England. The Protestant and Catholic attitude, this is a misspeech, as if Protestant and Catholic were antinomies. No. The Protestant is the Catholic view. We're not talking, when we say Catholic, we don't mean papist or Romanist. So Ridley here falls into that mistaken nomenclature. Rome was cut off. False gospel. Are there elect there? Of course there are. Absolutely. Are there converted people there? Yes, despite the structure. But doctrinally, in terms of the Council of Trent, Vatican I and II, no. There's been no retrenchment in doctrine. And time for the little snowflakes and cupcakes to get over this ecumenical urge to be nice and not call out the truth. Trent is Trent. They've never changed. So, yeah, we always want to be kind and loving to all with whom we engage in Roman Catholics. But we got to do history. So I don't like what Ridley's antithesis here. But anyways, you get my point. The Protestant and Catholic attitude on the subject of Cranmer, which was laid down in these publications, has followed with very little variation for the last 400 years. Again, this is published in 1960s. To the Protestants, Cranmer was an honest man. That's very true. Who began life under the disadvantage of having been educated as a papist. Well, we can nuance that. To the he therefore expounded papist doctrines. He did. and burned and persecuted Protestants until the truth was gradually revealed to him. Once he had seen the light, he did not falter until his final ordeal at Oxford. And there's truth in that. He did stand up to Henry VIII. Manuscripts back and forth between Henry VIII and Cranmer show that he was arguing for at least justification by faith alone, and he certainly was a sola scriptura man. I don't think it was until 1546 that he figured out with Ridley, basing his work on Bertram of Corby, Elfric's sermons in the 11th century, the Reformed view of the Eucharist. But that's another story. We'll get to that. He did not falter until his final ordeal at Oxford, which is an embarrassing scene. And his recantations, which were extracted from him by the fraudulent promise of life, brought more discredit on the papists than on him. And yeah, there's a lot to be said in that. What they did to that man was wicked. Evil, demonic. From the very beginning, recantations and other incidents placed Protestants, to some extent, on the defensive where Cranmer was concerned. But everything was excused because of his martyrdom. Yeah, there were criticisms before his death of being weak and tepid and timid, and there's some truth to that. We want to debride that, ponder that. Once he died as a martyr, criticism stopped. This is criticism from fellow reformers. And Fox, who was not blind to Cranmer's faults, we want to join with Fox in that. Oh, I mean, Cranmer was a human being born in original sin. Original sin and actual transgressions that do follow from it. Flaws. Who doesn't have flaws? Nevertheless, Fox felt able to declare that he was, quote, much more worthy the name of St. Thomas of Canterbury, and whom the Pope falsely before him did canonize, referring to Thomas Becket, who was killed in Canterbury Cathedral. They've got the spot down there, down around the northern transept area, where he was killed by some knights. So Fox thinks that Cranmer should be canonized rather than Thomas Becket, another previous Archbishop of Canterbury from the Middle Ages, middle from our standpoint. The Catholics, and he should say the Papists or the Romanists here, probably trying to be a polite historian. The Catholics saw Cranmer not merely as a heretic and heresiarch who led England into heresy, but also as a lascivious hypocrite. Had a wife and a careerist. That's interesting. Well, something to that angle. What else was he going to be? A non-careerist? He'd been picked by Henry to do this, that, and the other. I mean, you have a career. It's okay. But a careerist, time server and pensioner. That's the idea. A careerist who was not sincere in his heresy. This line was this is ridiculous. This line was put forward by the counsel for the prosecution at Cranmer's trial in 1555. That's an interesting read, the transcripts of that. The author of Bishop Cranmer's recantations wrote that Cranmer deserted his Luther at the time of the 6 Articles. No, he didn't. He argued against the 6 Articles in Parliament openly. But when Henry dropped the gavel, here's where he did accommodate Henry and went private, acquiesced, saw other men, English reformers, die. And to their credit, bishops Latimer and Shaxton resigned their episcopal see, and Tom could have done the same, but why not? So I agree, he was Weak. Unprincipled? It's hard to say. I mean, he believed in justification by faith alone, and there's some argument that, this was sliding in gently in the form of 10 articles, 1536. I haven't bought that yet, but we'll see as we go along. It is a quote from this author of Bishop Cranmer's recantation. If his doctrine were good, wrote Harpsfield, he's an anti-Cranmerian, why did he give it over? Close quote. Sanders wrote that Cranmer himself had been a Henrician. He had to be. Everybody was, including the papists, like Gardner. They were Henricians. That is a follower of Henry VIII, from whose instructions he never dared depart even a hair's breadth in anything. When the king died, 1547, January, Cranmer ceased to be a Henrician and became wholly a Lutheran, knowing at the same time that Henry had been a most earnest opponent of Luther, close quote, and published a Lutheran catechism. Now, this is a challenging point here. But a few months had hardly gone by when the miserable man found out that the protector of the king, the Duke of Somerset, was a Calvinist and not a Lutheran. So we're told. He recasts the catechism, changes his language, and he who was once a Henrician, then a Lutheran, becomes a Calvinist. This is what is reported at Cranmer's trial. He denied that. Parsons wrote that it was his nature, then and ever after, to quote unquote, run after the time. Well, what else was he supposed to do? He had a tyrannical king. He worked for him. He spoke to the king honestly and directly, and the king knew. He called him King Henry. He called him, I know who the greatest heretic is in Kent. He knew where Cranmer was standing. But Cranmer didn't have the tools. Henry didn't believe something, that was that. So we cut Cranmer some slack here in terms of the context and the persons with whom he was working. But people who knew him knew where he was at, and Gardner knew he was an English reformer. Cranmer was a big advocate for the English Bible in the late 1530s. Interesting, wonder what he knew about Tyndale. Cromwell knew about Tyndale. Continuing here, in the Catholic interpretation, should be the papists. Well, I may make that change here, edit Ridley's. In the papist interpretation, Cranmer was a man who, being chaplain to the Boleyn family, suggested to them that Anne could marry Henry and become queen if papal supremacy was overthrown. As a reward, the papists continue, he was granted the see of Canterbury, committing perjury in his consecration oath to the Pope. I think Cranmer was anti-papal when that marriage took place in 1533 in his consecration. I think he knew pretty much what the issues were. He'll tell Henry that I was anti-papal many years ago. I began praying for the downfall of the Pope. It raises the question what Cranmer knew about Wycliffe, who also was an Erastian. He refers, Cranmer does, to ancient manuscripts in English or Anglo-Saxon. And he refers to the fact that England had vernacular Bibles, as it were, vernacular preaching. It had only been in the last 300-400 years that they had Latin services. That needs to be kind of sorted out, the dates on that. Cranmer was aware of vernacular Bibles for the people, which is a big deal in the Reformation. Rome wanted to control everything, keep the people suppressed and ignorant. They say otherwise, and there are a lot of good services that were done by monasteries and churchmen, practical deeds, hospitals, schools. But a vernacular Bible was no. Cranmer stood for vernacular Bible very early on in a major way. He was a sola scriptura man. He was still doing Latin now at this time, Latin services, Serum Missal. You see, here go the papists. They charged him with curry favoring with the authorities while he showed his lecherous nature by his 2 marriages. His first wife died. And then he does pick up a wife on the QT in Germany. And his advocacy of the marriage of priests, well, he did. Cranmer, Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. Guess what? Peter, the supreme pope, Petrine supremacy, as the papists will tell us, confidently, repeatedly, historically, even down into our time of snowflakery, when they won't say it too loudly. We still believe that. Vatican II used softer language where this separated brethren go on about sacramental inefficiencies. At least they call us brethren. They used to burn us at the stake. So yes, he did support clerical marriage, as did Luther, Calvin. He got married. Peter Vermigli and I'm not sure about Bucer. I think Vermigli was married. I'd have to check on that. Anyways, they're saying Cranmer's a lecherous and a lewd man. Talk about anti-marriage? There's a Gnostic twinge to that. And the whole matter of clerical celibacy is still going on today. Navy chaplaincy, 2 out of every 3 guys was a can I say it? Can I be military for a moment? Fudge packers. It's a military term of art, which is a little crude for the public, but a little salty. Here's what they are. I mean, they have their own jokes among themselves about the gay guild, the pink seminaries. This is what they say. After committing high treason by supporting Jane Grey, they go on, he was called to account for his heresy. He then pretended to recant in order to save his life, but he repudiated his recantations and adhered to his heresies out of inveterate malice. See how history is written? Inveterate malice. When he knew that his ruse had failed and that he would be burned in any case. I believe that's true. I believe he was trying to get out of dying. No question. He was afraid of the stake. And he did recant, and it was abject. Oh, it's awful to read. I think that gets mitigated and minimized. And had they given him an escape route, I think he would have taken it and would have stuck to his position privately, which was this public recantation, which was not his real convictions. The Protestant view, and I wish you'd say the Protestant Reformed view of Cranmer, was again put forward by Bishop Godwin at the beginning of the 17th century and Lord Herbert in 1649. I think I got Herbert's work up there. While Fuller in 1655 defended Cranmer from the criticism of Prynne, or Prynne. Prynne was an English Puritan who didn't like Billy Laud. Prynne attacked Cranmer because he was a bishop. Prynne must have been a Presbyterian or a Congregationalist, which is kind of a cheap shot, really. After his release from the Tower, no doubt put there by Billy Laud, probably goaded into hostility by Billy Laud's impolite, impolitic, imprudent policy with arrogance and episcopal Prynne published in 1641 his Antipathy of the English Lordly Prelacy, both the regal monarchy and civil unity, in the course of which he attacked Cranmer, using many of the Catholic arguments or papist arguments. Some of them we have to concede. We'll get to that as we go along. He referred to the perjury and the consecration oath, to Cranmer's part in the persecution of Lambert. Point well taken. Cranmer was party to persecuting John Lambert, John Frith. Don't cut him any slack here. Aider and abettor, first degree homicide. A murderer, co-murderer. I forget what the legal term is. Someone who helps someone else kill somebody. Fuller replied with traditional defenses of Fox and the older Protestant writers. Charles I's chaplain, Peter Heylin, a good, stout Arminian, who at least on the subject of Cranmer could agree with Fuller, was equally laudatory in his Ecclesia Restaurata in 1661. At the end of the 17th century, two divines of the Church of England pursued extensive researches into the history of the Reformation and produced works which for the next 150 years ranked in Protestant eyes second only to Fox's book. John Stripp, who was of a French Huguenot background, French exiles from the Papists in France. John Stripp, in his quiet retirement at Hackney, augmented the historical labors in which Gilbert Burnet had engaged amid the excitements of revolutionary politics. Burnet, he was a bishop of Salisbury, did not have so high an opinion as Stripp did of Cranmer. But in his first volume of the History of the Reformation in 1679, he's up over in there somewhere, for which he received the thanks of a Whig parliament, he wrote that Cranmer had, quote, as eminent virtues and as few faults in him as in any prelate that has been in the Christian church in many ages.
Well, you're going to have to wait for me so we can get this done. Right. Now that you're on live stream, you can just record over the way.
No, but you're yelling.